Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for spending some time with us today. If you enjoy our conversation series, make sure you never miss an interview by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our work across the globe. For the first time ever, innovative virtual reality, VR technology, will be used in an educational Holocaust Remembrance exhibit. At the Illinois Holocaust Museum just outside of Chicago, the Journey Back, a VR experience, immerses visitors in an unforgettable emotional experience that will pass on the legacy of survivors in a way that resonates with current and future generations and provide visitors with a powerful glimpse of history in its darkest hour. Here to delve into this pioneering exhibit is Illinois Holocaust Museum CEO Susan Abrams. We'll talk about this new approach to Holocaust remembrance and the role that VR will play not only in teaching future generations about the horrors of the Shoah, but also countering rising anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and distortion. Susan, great to have you with us today.
So glad to be here with you. Thank you.
Well, some of our audience may know about virtual reality, VR, but for those who are less familiar, tell us about this cutting-edge technology, and at the same time, give us a brief overview of what VR is in its role in the Journey Back virtual reality exhibition and a summary of the user experience. I hear there's headsets and goggles, and tell us about it.
Absolutely. So virtual reality enables you in this instance to have a conversation, to visit a location such as where a survivor grew up or Auschwitz concentration camp with that survivor as the survivor is talking to you about the experience. So you can stand, for example, on the arrival ramp with Fritzi through having this headset on that you talked about. And while she's telling you about her experience, you're looking all around 360. You could spin in your seat, or if you're standing, move around. You can look up, down, and be there with her in that moment. I can share a few slides with you and even an intro video that we share in the experience that will give you more of an idea about what that looks like.
Before we get to it, though, let's talk about the goals of the exhibit. When this was, when you were around the table and you were talking about this, in addition to the technology, what were the goals? What did you want to accomplish, and what would you like visitors to walk away from the exhibit with?
Absolutely. We use the history and lessons of the Holocaust at Illinois Holocaust Museum to help our visitors and those we engage with develop empathy and an understanding of our common humanity. You mentioned the rising tide of anti-Semitism and, in fact, so many forms of hatred and bigotry. And the best way to combat that is by developing empathy and again, that understanding that we are all human beings here together. And there's no better way to do that than through this intimate experience or conversation, if you will, with another human being. And so this provides a really poignant way to learn about some of the horrors of the Holocaust, but also about the strength and resilience of survivors and their hopes for a better world for all of us. And that's why we share these stories.
And Illinois has a fairly large number of Holocaust survivors, does it not?
We have what we believe to be one of the largest speakers bureaus of survivors and eyewitnesses anywhere in the world. At the start of the pandemic, we had about 60 active speakers. That number has dwindled over the last couple of years, but we still have many who will speak both in person and virtually now through digital programming.
So before we get to the slides and the video, using VR,
yes,
visitors at the museum are, as you say, are transported back to different Holocaust sites.
Yes.
So they could be concentration camps. They're guided by survivors, and we're going to get to those, the two that you've highlighted for us today, who share with the visitors what they've endured. So maybe we should go to that now, take a look at the video, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more.
Sure. So I'm going to share my screen for just a moment here. So what you're seeing now is the entrance to our exhibition, our virtual reality gallery, the Richard and Jill Chaffetz Family Virtual Reality Gallery. And you can see the journey back of VR experience, which has two films about two different survivors that we'll talk about. Here you can see you enter the gallery, and there's an area where you see an introductory film that I'm going to share in just a moment before you enter the second part of the gallery to experience the VR itself. This is the intro film that provides a little context about the Holocaust and about the technology that you'll be experiencing. Take a look.
Auschwitz was the site of the largest mass murder in the history of humanity. More than 1.1 million people were murdered, including nearly 1 million Jews. At 13 years old, Fritzi Fritzschall arrived with her family. Fritzi became a slave laborer at a nearby factory. The youngest of 600 women, she promised them that if she survived, she would share their story.
A Promise Kept is a 360-degree immersive virtual reality experience. You will accompany Fritzi as she revisits Auschwitz, including the arrival ramp, barracks, and latrines. It's an honor to share her story with you today. At Illinois Holocaust Museum, we are preserving survivor stories in the most innovative and impactful ways while expanding how we capture the historical sites of the Holocaust for generations to come.
A Promise Kept was filmed over the course of a year in studios and on location, utilizing cutting-edge technology including photogrammetry, the stitching together of thousands of photographs to create digital 3D replicas of existing spaces. This fusion of art and science helps to tell this important story.
Today, you will hear one story from the Holocaust, but there are millions more. The 1.5 million Jewish children, the approximately 6 million Jews, and millions of others who were victims of Nazism. Fritzi has worked for much of her life to share her story, keeping her promise to those 599 women. Now, you too will be their messenger.
So that's the intro film. And then you enter into the primary part of the gallery where you put on the headset and you journey with Fritzi as she takes you on location, as we just saw some examples of.
So let's talk about the journey back. It features two survivors, both of whom are narrators in the exhibit, Fritzi Fritzschall, you mentioned, and George Brent, and two separate VR experiences. We saw a little bit of it here. Participants stand along Fritzi and Brent as they recount what happened to them during the Holocaust. How did Fritzi come to you, or how did you get to her and to George? How did that happen?
Great question. Fritzi has been a leader at our museum. She sadly passed away last summer, just before we opened the exhibition to the public, but fortunately she was able to see a version that was quite far along. But Fritzi, like a number of the survivors in our community, engaged in sharing her story going back to the late 1970s. That was where she first and others started to think about sharing. And that was when there was a proposed neo-Nazi march in Skokie, Illinois, which is the site of our museum, which you see behind me. And at that point, the survivors, who had most of them not shared anything with family or friends about the Holocaust for decades, just trying to put that experience behind them and learn a trade, develop a profession, start a family, live a regular life. They suddenly had the Holocaust thrust upon them and this anti-Semitism with these neo-Nazis. And they realized that education was the best antidote to fighting hatred and bigotry. And so they raised the resources at the time, they raised their voices, but they also raised resources to create what ultimately became Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. So that's the genesis of our museum. And for quite a number of survivors, it was also a start for sharing their own stories. Fritzi, it took her a little more time really until her son said to her, "You have grandchildren now. They're going to need to hear your story." And others too. And that was really when she started opening up, becoming active as a speaker and ultimately a leader at our museum.
I remember that the neo-Nazi March in Skokie well. I worked at that time for the Anti-Defamation League in New York. And now that I'm thinking back, that this was the genesis of that. From that grew this tremendous educational program is really something. Now, in Fritzi's case, she was 13 years old. I mean,
yes.
when she was first became a victim.
Yes, she was 13 when she and her family were taken from their home around this time of year, right around Passover, and sent first into a ghetto for a few days, and then ultimately on with her family, with her mother and two brothers and her grandfather, to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And her grandfather perished on that rail car during that trip, but she and her brothers and mother arrived. And actually, as she was on that arrival ramp and separated from her brothers, they were murdered. She never saw them again, and ultimately she was also separated at that time from her mother, never to see her again either.
So how does it work if you're a visitor and you're with Fritzi in this this program? Are you able to ask questions? How do people ask questions of the survivor, or how do they ask questions about the Holocaust while they're in the room? You've seen the picture, while they're sitting and experiencing this.
Yeah, they're immersed in it. So with that headset, again, you are immersed. So you can look around on that arrival ramp and see what Fritzi saw when she arrived. And then when you're in the barracks with her again, she is sharing exactly, and she'll point to the barrack part that she slept on, and you're looking at that, but you can turn and see everything else as well.
And once the visitors are there and they're with Fritzi, and they're having this experience, what happens if they have a question? Who do they ask? How are questions handled in a VR setting?
Yes, well, that's an interesting question. The questions are not handled in the VR setting. It again is immersive, and Fritzi is really the narrator sharing her experience. When the experience is over, it is a docented, we have a volunteer or staff person there, and they're available to answer questions. And we have a QR code because we know that it frequently does spark other questions. But additionally, another way that the museum, Illinois Holocaust Museum, has used and helped to develop breakthrough technology is with our survivor holograms. And in association with USC Shoah Foundation, we developed interactive survivor holograms using dimensions and testimony. And in that separate theater experience, you can ask the survivor hologram questions. So actually we find it works quite well at times for people. If they see the VR and it sparks additional questions, they can, if Fritzy's being shown or another survivor, go into the holographic theater, and there they can ask questions and real time using custom voice recognition software that's quite remarkable. The hologram answers you. So if you wanted to know more about how she kept her promise to those 599 women, or how else she was able to stay alive, you could ask her any number of questions, actually about 20,000 unique questions you could ask about life before, during, or after the Holocaust. So we've been using cutting edge technology at Illinois Holocaust Museum for quite some time. This was a multi-year project that we were the first in the world to debut then as well in 2017. And now in 2022, the first to debut this VR application where you can tour Auschwitz with Fritzy, and then as we'll talk about, Auschwitz, Mauthausen, and Ebensee with survivor George Brent.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. The second part of the journey back features George Brent. Tell us his story, and what will visitors see in his film titled "Don't Forget Me"?
Sure. So George grew up in a part of Czechoslovakia with his family. His father was a pharmacist. And they, as the Holocaust descended on them, were also sent to a ghetto, and then a few days later by rail car to Auschwitz. And most of George's family also was murdered. He and his father were identified as strong enough to be slave laborers, and so they were slave laborers there. And then as the war progressed and the Soviet troops were closing in, they were sent on a death march, and then ultimately by rail car again to two different concentration camps, first to Mauthausen, and then ultimately he also worked as a slave laborer as Ebensee, and it was from Ebensee that George was liberated. He discovered after liberation that his father was still alive and in a hospital in Germany. He found him, and then ultimately they emigrated to the United States, where George became a dentist and started a family, ultimately again engaging with our museum to share his story.
What does virtual reality technology give a visitor that traditional two-dimensional exhibits with text cannot? And why is this important? It's really taken a while. Now we have a number of Holocaust museums, not only here in the United States, but some are opening in Europe and elsewhere. This is really extremely encouraging. But now what you're doing here is you're setting the pace for the present and for the future. So tell us the difference. What is it that you can get from VR that you might not get from the traditional two-dimensional with text exhibition?
Yeah, great question. You feel it, it's immersive, it creates this engagement, right? You're not passively looking at something or reading it. You are engaged in it. You are surrounded by the environment, and you control where you look and how you absorb it. And it's also intimate. You're not in a huge theater with a lot of other people. When you are standing on that arrival ramp with Fritzy, it's the two of you, or with George and he's narrating, it's the two of you. And I think by having that engaging experience where you're controlling what you're looking at and how you're moving through it, it impacts you in a different kind of way. And it's not that you're imagining what Auschwitz might look like. You are literally, figuratively, you're standing on that arrival ramp and you are seeing it exactly as though you are there or in the barracks touring with Fritzy. I mean, so few of us will have that opportunity to visit an historical site like a concentration camp, let alone to visit it or tour it with a survivor or a person who lived that history. And so this combination of being immersive with being an intimate experience where you control just makes it so much more visceral. And we hear from people who have visited the sites, wow, I can't believe that. It's really like I was right back there again. So I think that's what it gives you, that sense again of really companionship with George or with Fritzy as they're sharing their experience with you.
Well, some of us have had an opportunity to actually visit the camps, but most people have not. I would venture a guess, certainly in our community even, most people have not had the opportunity to do this. They've read about it, and they may have seen other exhibitions, but they haven't really had a chance to experience the being there on the site. Now, the exhibit opened in January of this year on Holocaust Remembrance Day. Tell us about how museum visitors have reacted to the exhibit, and what would you say the ratio is Jewish to non-Jewish who have participated or attended already?
Yes, I think most of the time visitors are overcome to a certain extent. They need to sit for a minute and absorb it, and sometimes they exit the space and still are sitting and thinking about it. Others jump immediately to a range of different questions, some of which can be answered by our QR code or by the docent who is helping with the experience, or again through visiting our survivor holographic theater to be able to literally ask those questions. But I think most people find it breathtaking, and sometimes they're almost breathless from having had this emotional experience with this other incredible human being, somebody who has experienced the worst that the world has to offer and still emerged hopeful and working to make our world a better place.
So what role could a journey back and VR in general play in combating this tremendous spike in anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and distortion? So much of it is transmitted over the internet, and we see this on every continent. We've got it here in the United States, certainly have it in Europe and in so many other places. So what role do you think the technology, a journey back, and the technology in general can play in combating this phenomenon?
Well, as we discussed, it develops, these experiences with this other human being develop empathy and an understanding of our common humanity. So that is one of the prime ways to combat hatred. But the technology also, part of the brilliance of it is that it's scalable. So ultimately, millions will be able to have this experience, while we have actually, over the last year, it traveled the world doing the International Film Festival circuit and has been featured and won awards, the two films, at more than a dozen. I think we're at 14 right now, different film festivals. Fritzy's made its debut on the circuit at South by Southwest, for example, but they've been around the world. And interestingly, in our world today, both of these films were in Russia as part of a commemoration for International Day of Holocaust Remembrance. So we can scale this by taking it to other museums, as you've pointed out, and learning institutions. Maybe even some viewers of our talk today will want to reach out and see how they can bring it to their own community or organization. But ultimately, too, we will partner to make it available on headsets everywhere, whether in classrooms or owned by individuals, etc. So our mission is education, and we want this to be available globally for as many people as possible to have this experience.
And you're bringing a lot of school groups to the museum for this?
Yes, we are.
Let me ask you, you mentioned Fritzy's passing. As the last generation of Holocaust survivors, it really now is in extended age, and we know that, and we've seen, of course, each year. I think last year there's a tremendous number who passed away. These are people who saw it, they experienced it, as you're doing there. Now we're 3 generations, 4 generations removed. is VR technology the future of Holocaust education and remembrance in place of, I mean, it can never be fully in place of, but in place of those first, the experiences of those who went through it. I always used to say, years ago, as you mentioned, the Skokie NeoNazi March, and when we were making speeches back in the late 70s, we would say that the day will come when there will be no more people with the tattoos on their arms to say, I was there, I experienced it, this was done to me. And now, sadly, we're approaching that moment. So is this kind of immersive experience, is this the future? And what do you see as being the future of the technology? Where can it go even from here?
Well, I think quality, I think this absolutely is the future for that sad day when we don't have the survivors with us. When we started planning this, we thought it was all about the future generations, but we realized just about all of the 70,000 students and educators who come through the museum have the privilege pre-pandemic to hear from a live survivor, but not the general public, because we concentrated on the school children. So twice a month, we made it available to the public. But when we had added the interactive survivor holograms in our holographic theater, all of a sudden, every hour on the hour, every visitor could hear from and ask questions of a survivor. And now we have the VR shows on the half hour. So all visitors today and in the future to our museum and to the other sites that take this on, again, hoping to bring it to many other schools and museums and learning institutions to share with their audiences, and then personally beyond that, we'll be able to have these experiences. So I really do think that technology like this is the future. The urgency for us that we have felt over these last few years is to gather this. It gives me the chills still to think about the fact that the technology evolved to a point where we could, while we still had our survivors with us, create these experiences. Film Fritzi in Auschwitz, film her, as you saw also in a studio, put this all together. It's grueling. To create the holograms was 40 hours of recording. To create the VR was probably the same when you put it all together, plus the trip to Europe, to Auschwitz with Fritzi. So absolutely grueling. And it's just this remarkable thing that the technology and the ideas for it came together in time to create this. So we will have it for the future.
I know it's so important. It's important, first of all, in our own community, because we are generations removed. Those who remember the Holocaust, again, really a diminishing number. Children of survivors, third generation, now in the fourth generation. Some stories are passed on. We have some Holocaust education programs in the schools, but it is so important in our own community because this is so central to us as a people. And then in the non-Jewish community, I think the sky is the limit. It's so important to convey the dimensions of this genocide. So there's certainly no lack of the potential audience here, and we know that you're looking to bring as many people as you can into this experience, and we think that's really great, and it's necessary, really necessary. But tell us about other exhibits that visitors can check out at the Illinois Holocaust Museum.
Absolutely, and I want to come back to one thing you asked about, the percentage who might not be Jewish who visit our museum and would have these experiences, and that is in excess of 85% are not Jewish. So this is a humanity story. This is a humanity museum, and that's that's who we're engaging with, which we think is really important. But at Illinois Holocaust Museum, we use our exhibitions and our special exhibitions to both go deeper into aspects of the Holocaust, but also broader into other areas of social justice and human rights. So in addition to our core exhibitions, of course, on the Holocaust, our Take a Stand Center, which is quite remarkable and moves you from the history and lessons of the Holocaust to our world today via the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you have the opportunity to meet 3 upstanders as opposed to bystanders from the Holocaust, but 40 others working in the areas of civil, social, environmental, and economic rights. So that's and then the third part of the Take a Stand Center, we actually give visitors the tools to engage, to make our world a better place. So you can learn how to write a letter to the editor, or reach out to your congressperson, or to found an organization or join one. So many different things, and you can do some of that at the museum or email the toolkit to yourself. So that's our Take a Stand Center. We have a youth exhibition called Make a Difference, which is almost a version of the Take a Stand Center, but for youth about 8 to 12, so 3rd grade through 7th grade-ish. And then our special exhibition galleries, again, might go deeper into an aspect of the Holocaust, like one that we have now called Shanghai Safe Haven from the Holocaust. And that tells the lesser known story of how 20,000 Jews found refuge in Shanghai, China, and escaped death through the Holocaust that way. And people are amazed when they come and engage with that piece of history through our special exhibition. But another one that we have currently now also is called Rise Up, that looks at Stonewall and the LGBTQ rights movement. So continuing to look at how do we apply the history and lessons of the Holocaust to our world today, making connections to those issues of social justice and human rights that continue on. In addition to Rise Up, just as an example, over the last couple, we had Notorious RBG that looked at how our Supreme Court justice looked at human rights, often through the lens of gender, working towards rights, women's rights, but rights for all of us. And in her incredible way, with so much grace and humor. And we also had an exhibition called Mandela Struggle for Freedom that looked at the struggle for racial equity, which of course continues with us today.
Well, it sounds like you're meeting the challenge, and the challenge is that what happened between 1933 and 1945 should not be seen as simply another, historical period, or a 12-year period of Nazism, and then we moved on to something else. I mean, the challenge we have, and really you're meeting it, is to make it relevant, because if it's not made relevant, then it will simply be confined to history along with so many other things, and that cannot happen. So we really salute you for bringing the lessons current. Well, the exhibition is A Journey Back, a VR experience, open now at the Illinois Holocaust Museum in Skokie, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. And you can find out more about it and so much more at ilholocaustmuseum.org. Susan, thank you for introducing us to the Illinois Holocaust Museum's innovative Holocaust Remembrance exhibit that uses VR technology to educate current and future generations about the Shoah. It's been great speaking with you, and I'm sure a real learning experience for our audience.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, our thanks to Illinois Holocaust Museum CEO Susan Abrams for delving into the future of immersive Holocaust education and remembrance with us today. And thank you for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this interview, make sure you catch all of our programs by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our important work, including our efforts on the ground providing Ukrainian refugees in Poland, Moldova, and Romania, as well as those suffering brutal wartime conditions in Ukraine with basic necessities. For my guest, Susan Abrams, and for B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. See you again soon.